Sarah Chen stared at her phone screen, watching the notifications pile up like digital debris. 37 missed calls from a number she hadn't seen in 3 years. The same number that had hurled those final words at her during their last conversation. "You're dead to me, Sarah. Dead to me." Now, that same voice was desperately trying to reach her, each unanswered ring a testament to how dramatically the tables had turned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She set the phone face down on her mahogany desk, the same desk where she'd signed the papers that made her the youngest partner in Morrison and Associates history. At 29, she'd built the most successful real estate division in downtown Seattle, managing a portfolio worth over $40 million. The irony wasn't lost on her that David, the brother who'd cut her out of his life over a real estate decision, was now drowning in his own property crisis. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, casting long shadows across the awards and recognition plaques that lined her walls. Sarah had earned every single one of them through sheer determination and an almost obsessive attention to market trends that others dismissed as insignificant. While her colleagues relied on traditional methods and established connections, she'd revolutionized property investment strategies by identifying emerging neighborhoods months before they became profitable. Her success hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't come easily. 3 years ago, she'd been working as a junior agent at a struggling firm, sharing a cramped studio apartment and surviving on instant noodles and determination. The transformation began with a single property deal that everyone else had written off as a lost cause, a rundown warehouse in what was then considered the worst part of Pioneer Square. Sarah had seen what others couldn't. The subtle signs of gentrification beginning to creep into the area. The coffee shop that opened quietly on the corner. The young professionals who started walking through the neighborhood instead of around it. The city planning documents that hinted at infrastructure improvements. She'd mortgaged her future on that instinct, convincing her then-boyfriend to co-sign a loan she had no business qualifying for, and purchased the warehouse for a fraction of what it would be worth 18 months later. That warehouse became the foundation of everything that followed. Sarah renovated it herself, spending weekends learning plumbing and electrical work through tutorial videos, transforming the space into modern loft apartments that attracted exactly the demographic she predicted would discover the area. Within 6 months, she'd sold all 4 units for triple her investment. More importantly, she'd proven her ability to read market signals that established agents missed entirely. The success attracted attention from Morrison and Associates, Seattle's most prestigious real estate firm. They offered her a position that came with resources, credibility, and access to deals that could multiply her growing reputation. Sarah accepted, but on her own terms. She negotiated equity participation in every deal she brought to the firm, ensuring that her success would build wealth rather than just commissions. Her rise to the company's ranks was meteoric. Within 18 months, she'd closed more high-value deals than agents with decades of experience. Her specialty became identifying properties and neighborhoods on the verge of transformation, then structuring investments that maximize returns for both the firm and her growing list of private clients. She developed a reputation for being 3 steps ahead of market trends, an oracle who could predict where Seattle's explosive growth would spread next. The partnership offer came exactly 2 years after her warehouse success. Morrison himself had called her into his office, a space she'd only entered twice before, and offered her something unprecedented: full partnership with equity stakes and decision-making authority over the firm's residential division. At 28, she became the youngest partner in the company's 40-year history. That promotion had changed everything, not just professionally, but personally. The small studio apartment gave way to a waterfront condo in Belltown. The secondhand Honda became a Tesla Model S. Most significantly, the constant financial anxiety that had defined her early 20s disappeared, replaced by the confidence that came from understanding her own market value. Sarah's phone buzzed against the desk. Another call from David. She glanced at the caller ID, then deliberately pressed decline. Whatever crisis had prompted 37 desperate attempts to reach her could wait until she decided whether their 3-year estrangement was worth breaking for his convenience. The estrangement hadn't begun with harsh words or dramatic confrontation.
Like many family rifts, it had started with a disagreement that escalated beyond all reasonable proportion, fueled by pride, misunderstanding, and fundamental differences in how they approached life's challenges. The specific trigger was a property that their grandmother had left to both of them in her will, a modest two-bedroom house in Greenwood that held more sentimental value than market worth. Their grandmother, Helen, had raised them both after their parents died in a car accident when Sarah was 12 and David was 15. The Greenwood house had been their refuge during those impossible teenage years, the place where Helen's quiet strength and unwavering love had held their shattered world together. When she passed away 5 years ago, leaving the house to both grandchildren equally, it seemed like a simple matter of deciding what to do with a shared inheritance. David had wanted to keep the house unchanged, preserve it as a family shrine where future generations could connect with their grandmother's memory. His vision was romantic, but impractical. Maintaining a property that needed significant repairs while keeping it empty most of the year, treating it as a museum rather than addressing its declining condition and her grandmother's mounting medical debts.
Sarah, even before her real estate expertise fully developed, had seen the situation more pragmatically. The house needed a new roof, updated electrical systems, and foundation repairs that would cost more than either of them could afford on their current salaries. Greenwood itself was showing early signs of the development pressure that was transforming neighborhoods throughout Seattle. Rather than watching the property deteriorate while they struggled to maintain it, she'd proposed selling to a young family who would love and restore the house, while providing them with enough money to pay off their grandmother's debts and establish small nest eggs for their own futures. The proposal had triggered something fundamental in David. He'd accused Sarah of caring more about money than family legacy, of being willing to sell their grandmother's memory to the highest bidder. Their argument had escalated over several months, with David interpreting Sarah's market analysis as cold calculation and Sarah viewing his preservation fantasy as financially irresponsible sentimentality. The breaking point had come during a heated phone conversation exactly 3 years ago. Sarah had discovered that David was secretly taking out loans against his portion of the inheritance to pay for repairs he couldn't afford, essentially mortgaging his future to maintain a property that was becoming a financial drain. When she'd confronted him about the loans, pointing out that he was making the same mistakes that had left their grandmother in debt, David had exploded. "You think everything is about money," he'd shouted through the phone. "You can't understand that some things matter more than profit margins and investment returns. Grandma Helen meant something beyond what she's worth on paper." Sarah had tried to explain that selling the house to a family who would restore and cherish it honored their grandmother's memory better than letting it decay while they both struggled financially. But David had been beyond reason, convinced that Sarah's practical approach represented fundamental heartlessness. "I know exactly who you are now," he'd said, his voice cold with finality. "You're someone who puts money before family, profit before people. I don't want anything to do with someone like that. As far as I'm concerned, you're dead to me, Sarah. Dead to me." He'd hung up before she could respond, and they hadn't spoken since. The house had remained in legal limbo, neither of them able to move forward without the other's agreement, slowly deteriorating while they maintained their stubborn positions. Sarah had eventually stopped trying to contact David, focusing instead on building her career and proving that her financial instincts, however cooled they might seem, were fundamentally sound. Now, 3 years later, David was calling her with the desperation that came from having his mortgage application denied. Sarah didn't need to answer the phone to understand what had happened. Real estate agents developed an intuitive sense for market conditions and lending patterns. She knew that David's teaching salary, combined with whatever debt he had accumulated trying to maintain their grandmother's house, had finally caught up with him. The mortgage denial probably meant he'd been trying to buy his own place, likely something modest that matched his income as a high school history teacher. But lending standards had tightened considerably in the past year, and banks were scrutinizing debt-to-income ratios with new intensity. If David had outstanding loans against the inherited property, along with credit card debt from covering repair costs, his financial profile would raise red flags for any conservative lender. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. "Please call me back. It's an emergency. I need your help." The desperation in those simple words was palpable, a far cry from the righteous anger that had characterized their last conversation.
She stared at the message for a long moment, weighing 3 years of silence against whatever crisis had humbled her stubborn older brother. Her assistant knocked gently on the office door, reminding Sarah that she had a client meeting in 15 minutes. Patricia Hernandez was a successful surgeon looking to purchase her first investment property, exactly the kind of high net worth client that had made Sarah's reputation. The meeting would require her full attention, sophisticated market analysis, and strategic thinking about portfolio diversification. Sarah saved David's number in her contacts for the first time in 3 years, but didn't return his call. Whatever had gone wrong with his mortgage application wasn't going anywhere in the next few hours, and she had professional obligations that took precedence over family drama, especially family drama involving someone who declared her dead to him. The meeting with Dr. Hernandez went exceptionally well. Sarah presented a carefully curated selection of properties that balanced immediate rental income with long-term appreciation potential. Her analysis included neighborhood development patterns, school district ratings, and transportation infrastructure improvements that would impact property values over the next decade. By the end of their 2-hour consultation, Dr. Hernandez had committed to purchasing a duplex in Wallingford and asked Sarah to identify additional investment opportunities. As Dr. Hernandez left, Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction that came from matching sophisticated clients with properties that would exceed their expectations. This was what she'd built her reputation on, understanding that real estate investment was about much more than buying and selling buildings. It was about reading the complex dynamics of urban growth, demographic shifts, and economic trends that determined where value would emerge.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Her phone had accumulated 6 more missed calls from David during the meeting, plus another text. "Sarah, I know we haven't talked, but I'm in real trouble. Please." The escalating desperation was obvious, but Sarah found herself surprisingly unmoved by his appeals. 3 years of silence couldn't be erased by a few desperate messages when he needed something from her. She decided to research David's situation before deciding whether to respond. As a real estate professional, she had access to property records, mortgage databases, and credit information that would paint a clear picture of whatever financial crisis had prompted his panic. If David wanted her help, she needed to understand exactly what kind of trouble he was facing. The research took less than an hour, and the results were worse than Sarah had anticipated. David had indeed taken out multiple loans against his portion of the inherited property, accumulating nearly $60,000 in debt to cover repairs and maintenance on a house now worth approximately $90,000. His teaching salary of $42,000 per year, combined with this debt load, created a financial profile that no responsible lender would approve for additional credit. More troubling, the property records showed that their grandmother's house had been cited by the city for code violations twice in the past year. The electrical system that Sarah had identified as problematic 3 years ago had apparently failed, and the foundation issues she'd warned about had worsened to the point where the city considered the structure potentially unsafe. David's romantic vision of preserving the house had become a nightmare of mounting debt and deteriorating conditions. Sarah cross-referenced the mortgage application databases her firm subscribed to and found David's recent application for a modest townhouse in Linwood. The purchase price was reasonable for his income level, but the debt-to-income ratio, including his existing obligations, made approval impossible. He'd been turned down by 3 different lenders in the past month, each rejection undoubtedly adding to his desperation. The full picture was both predictable and sad. David's sentimental attachment to their grandmother's house had trapped him in exactly the financial spiral Sarah had foreseen 3 years ago. His determination to preserve the property, unchanged, had resulted in a deteriorating asset that consumed his resources while providing no return. Meanwhile, Sarah's supposedly heartless approach to their inheritance had allowed her to build wealth and security that could have benefited both of them. As Sarah reviewed the documents spread across her desk, she felt an unexpected mixture of vindication and sadness. She'd been right about the practical realities, but being right hadn't prevented her brother from making choices that led to his current crisis.
The question now was whether their relationship could survive the collision between his romantic idealism and the harsh realities of his financial situation. Her phone rang again, David's number appearing for the 40th time that day. This time, Sarah answered. "Hello, David," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Sarah, oh God, thank you for picking up." His voice was strained, exhausted from what had clearly been a sleepless night. "I know I have no right to call you after what I said, but I'm drowning here and I don't know who else to turn to." "I'm listening," she replied, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "My mortgage got denied again, the third time in a month. I found this perfect little place, nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom townhouse where I could finally have some space and maybe start fresh. But they keep saying my debt-to-income ratio is too high, and I don't understand how that's possible when I've been making all my payments." Sarah already knew the answer, but she let him continue. "The thing is, I think it's because of the loans on Grandma's house. I've been trying to fix it up, make it livable again, but everything costs so much more than I expected. The electrical system failed completely, and now the city is saying there are foundation problems that could make the whole structure unsafe." "How much debt have you accumulated on the property?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. David was quiet for a moment. "About $60,000, maybe a little more. I kept thinking that once I got everything fixed, the house would be worth more and I could refinance or sell it for enough to pay everything back. But it just keeps needing more work." "David, the house is worth approximately $90,000 in its current condition. If you've borrowed $60,000 against it, you're already underwater on an asset that's continuing to deteriorate." "I know," he whispered. "I know it was stupid.
You tried to tell me this would happen, and I didn't listen. I thought I was honoring Grandma's memory, but I've turned her house into a financial disaster." The admission of fault, delivered with genuine remorse, caught Sarah off guard. This wasn't the righteous, angry brother who declared her dead to him 3 years ago. This was someone who'd finally confronted the consequences of choices made from emotion rather than analysis. "What exactly are you asking from me, David?" she said, maintaining professional distance despite the personal nature of their conversation. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe you could co-sign for the mortgage? Or maybe there's some way to fix my credit situation so I can qualify? I know you're successful now, and I thought maybe you'd understand the real estate side better than I do." Sarah looked out at the Seattle skyline, considering the complexity of what David was really asking. He wanted her to solve a problem that had been years in the making, using expertise he'd once dismissed as heartless calculation. More fundamentally, he wanted her to risk her own financial standing to help him escape consequences of decisions he'd made against her explicit advice. "Co-signing a mortgage means I'd be legally responsible for the debt if you default," she explained patiently. "Given your current financial situation, that would be a significant risk for me to take." "I understand," David said quickly. "I wouldn't ask if I had any other options. I've been renting the same studio apartment for 5 years, and the landlord just announced he's selling the building. All the tenants have to be out by the end of next month. I can't find anything affordable in the rental market. And without qualifying for a mortgage, I don't know where I'm going to live." The housing crisis that had made Sarah wealthy was now crushing her brother. Seattle's rapid growth had pushed rental prices beyond what teachers could afford, while simultaneously making homeownership impossible for people with compromised credit. David was caught in the squeeze between rising costs and stagnant wages that affected thousands of residents throughout the region. "Have you considered selling your half of the grandmother's house?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew his answer. "I can't," he replied immediately. "Not after everything I've put into trying to save it. And besides, even if we sold it for full market value, I'd barely break even after paying back the loans. It wouldn't solve my mortgage qualification problem." Sarah did quick calculations in her head. If they could sell the house for $90,000, David's half would be $45,000, which would indeed barely cover his accumulated debt. He'd essentially spent 3 years converting an inheritance into a break-even proposition, while destroying his credit rating in the process. "I need to think about this," Sarah said finally,
The co-signing request is complicated, and I'd need to review your complete financial picture before making any commitments. Of course, David said eagerly. I can send you whatever documents you need. Bank statements, tax returns, the mortgage rejection letters, everything. Send me everything by email tonight. I'll review it over the weekend and call you on Monday with my thoughts. Sarah, David said, his voice thick with emotion, I know I don't deserve your help after what I said to you. I was wrong about so many things, and I've been too proud to admit it. You were trying to help both of us, and I turned it into something ugly because I couldn't handle being wrong. The apology, unexpected and seemingly genuine, created a crack in the wall Sarah had built around her feelings about their estrangement. She'd spent 3 years telling herself that David's rejection hadn't hurt, that his accusations about her heartlessness were simply the opinions of someone too naive to understand how the world actually worked. But hearing him acknowledge his mistakes touched something she'd been careful to keep buried. We'll talk on Monday, she said, maintaining professional tone despite the emotional undercurrents. Send me those documents tonight. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her office as evening light faded over Elliott Bay, processing the unexpected turn her day had taken. 40 missed calls had brought her brother back into her life, not with apology or reconciliation, but with desperate need for exactly the expertise he'd once condemned as heartless.
The situation was more complex than simple family reconciliation. David's financial crisis was real and immediate, but helping him would require Sarah to risk her own credit and potentially her professional reputation. If she co-signed a mortgage for someone with his debt profile and he defaulted, it could damage her standing with lenders and impact her ability to structure deals for her clients. Yet, underneath the practical considerations lay deeper questions about family obligation and forgiveness. David had hurt her deeply with his accusations and his willingness to cut her out of his life completely. His current crisis was largely the result of choices he'd made against her advice, motivated by the same romantic idealism that had led him to dismiss her practical concerns as greed. Sarah's phone buzzed with the first of David's promised documents, his tax returns for the past 3 years, showing the modest but steady income of a dedicated teacher. Despite everything, she found herself hoping that his financial situation might be more salvageable than her initial research had suggested. Whatever anger she carried from their estrangement, she didn't want to see him homeless because of mistakes made from misguided love for their grandmother's memory. As she prepared to leave the office, Sarah realized that the weekend ahead would involve more than just reviewing David's financial documents. She'd need to examine her own feelings about forgiveness, family loyalty, and the price of being right when being right meant watching someone you love make destructive choices. The young woman who'd been declared dead by her brother 3 years ago had built a life of security and success through careful analysis and strategic thinking. The question now was whether that same analytical approach could navigate the emotional complexity of a family relationship damaged by pride, misunderstanding, and fundamentally different approaches to honoring their shared past. Outside her office windows, Seattle's lights sparkled across the water, each light representing someone making choices about home, family, and future. Tomorrow she'd begin the process of determining whether her brother's 40 missed calls represented genuine change or simply desperation-driven convenience. Either way, the silence between them had finally been broken, and the conversation that followed would determine whether their relationship could be rebuilt on more honest foundations than the romantic myths that had led to its original destruction. Sarah gathered David's documents and her own analysis of his situation, preparing for a weekend that would require her to be simultaneously the successful real estate professional she'd become and the sister she'd never stopped being, despite 3 years of silence. The challenge ahead wasn't just about mortgage applications and debt-to-income ratios. It was about whether love could survive the collision between dreams and reality, whether family bonds could be rebuilt after being severed by pride and misunderstanding. The elevator carried her down from her corner office toward the parking garage where her Tesla waited, loaded with documents that would determine not just David's housing future, but the possibility of their relationship's resurrection. Whatever she decided over the weekend would echo through both their lives for years to come, another investment decision that would yield returns measured not just in money, but in the complex currency of family reconciliation.
Sarah's weekend began at 5:30 Saturday morning, not by choice, but because her mind refused to quiet after reviewing David's financial documents until nearly midnight. The paper spread across her dining room table painted a picture even grimmer than her preliminary research had suggested. 3 years of desperate financial decisions had created a web of debt that would challenge even her professional expertise to untangle. The coffee maker gurgled to life as she settled back into the chair where she'd spent the previous evening, David's bank statements and loan documents arranged in chronological order, like evidence in a case she was trying to solve. The story they told was one of good intentions colliding repeatedly with financial reality, each collision leaving David deeper in debt and further from his goal of preserving their grandmother's house. The first loan, taken 18 months after their grandmother's death, had seemed reasonable enough. $15,000 to replace the roof that had been leaking for years, secured against David's half of the property. Sarah remembered the satisfaction she had felt reading that particular document, knowing that her brother had finally acknowledged at least one of the practical concerns she'd raised during their arguments. But the roof repair had revealed additional problems, as major home renovations inevitably do. The contractor had discovered that the electrical system, installed sometime in the 1960s, was not only outdated but dangerous. Bringing it up to code required rewiring the entire house, an unexpected expense that consumed another $12,000. David had taken a second loan to cover the electrical work, still believing that each repair brought him closer to making the house livable again. The foundation problems had surfaced 6 months later, exactly as Sarah had predicted they would. What began as minor settling had evolved into structural concerns that required professional engineering assessment and extensive underpinning work. The estimate for foundation repairs had shocked David into temporary inaction, but when the city issued its first code violation notice, he'd been forced to take a third loan for $22,000 to address the immediate safety concerns. Sarah traced the progression through his bank statements, watching his savings account dwindle from a modest but healthy balance to perpetual overdraft protection. David's teaching salary, adequate for a single man with reasonable expenses, couldn't sustain the carrying costs of 3 loans plus the ongoing maintenance of a house that seemed determined to consume every dollar he could borrow against it. The most heartbreaking aspect of the documentation was David's meticulous record keeping. Every receipt, every contractor estimate, every permit application had been carefully filed and organized. He'd approached the restoration project with the same methodical attention to detail that made him an excellent teacher, treating the house's problems as educational challenges to be systematically solved rather than financial disasters to be strategically managed. His mortgage application documents revealed the full extent of his current predicament. The townhouse he'd hoped to purchase was modest by Seattle standards, a 1,200 square foot end unit in a development designed for first-time buyers. The asking price was $240,000, and the monthly payments would have been manageable on his teaching salary. But the combination of his existing debt service and the property taxes on their grandmother's deteriorating house pushed his debt-to-income ratio well beyond what any responsible lender would accept. Sarah calculated the numbers multiple ways, searching for some creative financing solution that might make David's homeownership dream feasible. But every scenario led to the same conclusion. He was trapped in a cycle where his sentimental attachment to their grandmother's house prevented him from qualifying for housing he could actually afford to live in. The irony was particularly sharp because David's dedication to his teaching career had actually improved his employment stability and earning potential over the past 3 years. He'd completed his master's degree in education, earned tenure at Roosevelt High School, and taken on additional responsibilities that had increased his annual salary to $48,000. Under normal circumstances, his employment history and income growth would have made him an attractive candidate for a modest mortgage.
But circumstances weren't normal, and David's financial profile told the story of someone who'd prioritized emotional attachment over practical planning. Sarah found herself simultaneously frustrated by his choices and impressed by his commitment to what he believed was right. The brother who'd accused her of putting money before family had literally mortgaged his future to preserve their grandmother's memory, even as that preservation effort had become economically destructive. By mid-morning, Sarah had developed a preliminary analysis of David's options, none of which were particularly appealing. The most straightforward solution would be to sell their grandmother's house immediately, use David's half of the proceeds to pay down his debt, and hope that improving his debt-to-income ratio would eventually make him eligible for conventional financing. But even if they could find a buyer willing to purchase a property with known structural issues, the timeline for sale completion and debt payoff would likely exceed the deadline for David's current housing crisis. The co-signing option that David had mentioned carried significant risks for Sarah personally and professionally. If she guaranteed his mortgage and he defaulted, the resulting credit damage could affect her ability to structure financing for her own clients. More importantly, David's track record of financial decision-making over the past 3 years didn't inspire confidence in his ability to manage mortgage payments responsibly while also addressing his existing debt obligations. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from David. "I know you said Monday, but I've been up all night thinking about this. Could we possibly meet today? I can come to your office or wherever works for you. I promise I won't take much of your time." The desperation in his message was palpable, and Sarah recognized the sleepless anxiety that drove people to send texts at inappropriate hours when facing financial crises. She'd seen the same pattern with clients who found themselves over-leveraged in changing market conditions, the gradual realization that their situation was more serious than they'd initially understood. She responded simply, "My office at 2 p.m. Bring any documents you haven't already sent." The morning hours until their meeting crawled by with unusual slowness. Sarah attempted to focus on other work, reviewing property analyses for her Monday appointments, and updating market projections for several ongoing client relationships. But her attention kept drifting back to David's situation and the larger questions it raised about family obligation, professional ethics, and the price of being proven right about predictions no one wanted to hear. At exactly 2 o'clock, Sarah heard the elevator open on her floor, followed by tentative footsteps in the hallway outside her office. She'd deliberately chosen to meet at Morrison & Associates rather than somewhere neutral, wanting David to see the professional environment she'd built while also maintaining the formal distance that serious financial discussions required. David appeared in her doorway, looking older than his 32 years, his usually neat appearance slightly rumpled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. He carried a manila folder thick with additional documents and wore the expression of someone who'd finally grasped the full extent of his problems. "Thank you for seeing me today," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk with visible nervousness. "I know your weekends are your personal time." "Real estate doesn't observe regular business hours," Sarah replied neutrally. "Crisis management is often a weekend activity in this industry." The characterization of his situation as crisis management rather than family assistance established the professional framework she intended to maintain. David nodded understanding, though she noticed him glancing around her office with what appeared to be genuine surprise at the scale of success her surroundings implied. "I brought the additional documents you might need," he said, sliding the manila folder across her desk. "Tax returns going back 5 years, employment verification letters, documentation of all the work done on the house, estimates for remaining repairs." Sarah opened the folder and began reviewing the new materials methodically. The employment verification confirmed what she'd already surmised. David was a dedicated, well-regarded teacher whose income had grown steadily despite his financial struggles. The contractor estimates revealed that their grandmother's house would require an additional $30,000 to $40,000 in repairs to meet current building codes and market standards for habitable condition. "These repair estimates," Sarah said, looking up from the documents, "do they include everything needed to make the house sellable, or just the minimum to address code violations?" "Just the code violations," David admitted. "To actually restore it to the condition Grandma would have wanted, we'd probably be looking at $60,000 or $70,000 more. New kitchen, updated bathrooms, refinished floors, exterior painting." Sarah did quick calculations based on current market conditions in the Greenwood neighborhood. Even with comprehensive renovations, their grandmother's house would likely top out at around $130,000 in value, assuming no major additional problems surfaced during the restoration process.
David had already borrowed $60,000 against the property and would need another $70,000 to complete the renovations, creating a total investment of $130,000 to achieve a property worth approximately the same amount. David, she said carefully, even if you could afford to complete all these repairs, you'd essentially break even on the investment. The house would be worth roughly what you'd put into it, assuming no additional problems emerged during renovation. I know, he replied quietly. I've been trying not to think about it in those terms, but I know you're right. I got so focused on saving the house that I lost track of whether saving it actually made financial sense. The admission represented a significant evolution from the brother who'd accused her of putting money before family 3 years earlier. She recognized the painful process of watching romantic ideals collide with mathematical reality, something she'd witnessed with numerous clients who'd fallen in love with properties that couldn't support their emotional investment. Help me understand what you're really asking from me.
Are you looking for a cosigner to help you qualify for the townhouse mortgage? Or are you looking for a broader solution to your overall financial situation? David was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands folded in his lap. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from desperate hope to something resembling genuine vulnerability. Honestly, I'm not sure anymore. When I called you yesterday, I thought I just needed someone with good credit to co-sign so I could buy the townhouse and get out of my rental situation. But looking at all these numbers spread out, I'm starting to realize that the mortgage problem is just a symptom of bigger issues. What bigger issues? Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew his answer. I've been making emotional decisions about money for 3 years instead of practical ones. The same emotional decisions you tried to warn me about when we first inherited the house. I convinced myself that preserving Grandma's house was about honoring her memory, but really it was about not wanting to face the reality that she was gone and our childhood was over. The psychological insight surprised Sarah with its depth and honesty. This wasn't the defensive, righteous brother who declared her dead to him 3 years ago. This was someone who'd been forced to confront the consequences of choices made from grief rather than analysis. The house became a way to avoid dealing with loss, David continued. Every repair project was proof that I was taking care of her legacy, that I was the good grandson who wouldn't abandon what she'd left us. But I turned it into something she never would have wanted, a financial burden that's preventing me from building my own future. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the protective anger she'd maintained since their estrangement. David's self-awareness was genuine, and his willingness to examine his own motivations showed a maturity she hadn't seen from him before. What made you realize this? Sarah asked. The third mortgage rejection, David answered immediately. When the loan officer explained that I was carrying too much debt to qualify for additional borrowing, I finally understood what you'd been trying to tell me 3 years ago. I'd turned Grandma's gift into a trap that was preventing me from moving forward with my life. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. And then I realized that you'd been dealing with the same loss I was, but you'd found a way to honor Grandma's memory that actually created something positive, instead of just preserving something that was deteriorating. How do you mean? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Your success in real estate, helping families find homes, building wealth that creates security instead of debt. That's what Grandma would have wanted for both of us. Lives that build something meaningful rather than just maintaining the past. The observation touched something deep in Sarah's understanding of her own career choices. She'd never explicitly connected her professional success to honoring their grandmother's memory, but David's insight resonated with childhood memories of Helen Chen's practical wisdom and her emphasis on building rather than dwelling. So, what are you asking from me now? Sarah said, returning to the practical question that would determine their path forward. I don't know if I have the right to ask anything, David replied, honestly. I cut you out of my life when you were trying to help me make better decisions. I called you heartless for suggesting we sell the house to a family who would love it, instead of letting it decay while I went into debt trying to maintain it.
He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on Sarah's desk between them. Before we talk about mortgages or co-signing or any of that, I need to give you this. I wrote it last night after I sent all the financial documents. Sarah opened the envelope to find a handwritten letter on David's familiar stationery, the same paper he used for personal correspondence with students and colleagues. His neat handwriting filled 2 pages with thoughts that had clearly taken considerable time and reflection to articulate. Sarah, I've spent 3 years trying to convince myself that I was right to cut you out of my life, that your practical approach to Grandma's house represented some fundamental heartlessness that made you unworthy of family connection. But the truth is that I was angry at you for being right about things I didn't want to face. She continued reading as David sat quietly across from her desk. When you suggested selling the house to a young family who would restore and cherish it, you were honoring Grandma's memory in a way I couldn't see at the time. She always said that homes were meant to be lived in, not preserved like museums. She would have loved knowing that her house became a place where children grew up and families built memories. The letter went on to acknowledge specific points Sarah had made during their arguments 3 years earlier, predictions about repair costs and market conditions that had proven accurate down to surprising detail. But more than factual vindication, David had written about the emotional realization that his preservation efforts had dishonored their grandmother's practical wisdom and her emphasis on building rather than dwelling.
I've been thinking about the last conversation I had with Grandma before she got really sick, the letter continued. She told me that the most important thing wasn't what she left us, but what we did with our lives afterward. She said she wanted her death to be a beginning for us, not an ending. I turned her house into an ending, a place where I could avoid moving forward with my own life. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she read David's acknowledgement of their grandmother's actual values and priorities. Helen Chen had indeed been practical above all else, someone who measured success by results rather than intentions, and who had little patience for sentiment that prevented action. The letter concluded with an apology that felt both complete and specific. I'm sorry for cutting you out of my life when you were trying to help me make better decisions. I'm sorry for calling you heartless when you were actually showing more love for Grandma's memory than my sentimental preservation efforts ever did. And I'm sorry for waiting until I needed your help to realize how wrong I was about everything. Sarah set the letter down on her desk, taking a moment to process the unexpected depth of David's reflection and the sincerity of his accountability for their estrangement. This was the conversation she'd needed to have 3 years ago, but David hadn't been ready to examine his own motivations then. Thank you for writing this, she said finally. It helps me understand where your head was during that time, and it's a genuine apology for some things that really hurt. I know a letter can't undo 3 years of silence, David replied, but I wanted you to know that I understand now how my emotional decision-making affected both of us, not just me. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the shift that David's honesty had created in their interaction. When Sarah spoke again, her tone had warmed noticeably from the professional distance she'd maintained at the beginning of their meeting. Let's talk about practical solutions, she said. Co-signing your mortgage would put me at financial risk that I'm not comfortable taking, given your current debt load and track record. But there might be other approaches that could help your situation without creating unacceptable risk for either of us. David nodded, clearly having expected this boundary. I understand completely. What other approaches are you thinking about? Sarah turned to her computer and pulled up a spreadsheet she'd created during her morning analysis. First, we need to address the fundamental problem, the debt load from Grandma's house that's preventing you from qualifying for conventional financing. That means we probably need to sell the property, but we need to do it strategically to maximize your financial recovery. She turned the screen toward David so he could see her calculations. The house in its current condition is worth approximately $90,000 to a buyer willing to take on renovation projects. But if we market it specifically to investors or contractors who specialize in restoration work, we might be able to get closer to $100,000.
That would still leave me about $15,000 short of breaking even on the loans, David observed. Correct. But breaking even isn't the goal here. The goal is improving your debt-to-income ratio enough to qualify for conventional financing on housing you can actually afford. Sarah highlighted different sections of her spreadsheet as she explained her thinking. If we sell the house for $100,000, your half would be $50,000. After paying down your portion of the loans, you'd still owe about $10,000, but that debt would no longer be secured against depreciating real estate. We could structure it as an unsecured personal loan with manageable monthly payments. And that would improve my mortgage qualification? David asked. Significantly. Your debt-to-income ratio would drop from about 60% to around 30%, well within acceptable ranges for conventional lending. You might not qualify for the townhouse you were originally considering, but you'd have options in the condo market or smaller single-family homes. David studied the numbers on Sarah's screen with growing understanding. This is exactly what you were proposing 3 years ago, isn't it? Sell the house to improve both our financial positions instead of letting it drain our resources. The basic concept is the same, though your debt accumulation has made the numbers more challenging than they would have been 3 years ago. How much more challenging? David asked, clearly dreading the answer. Sarah switched to another tab on her spreadsheet.
If we'd sold the house when I originally suggested it, before you took any loans against it, your half of the proceeds would have been $45,000 in cash. That would have been enough for a down payment on the townhouse you want now, with conventional financing and no cosigner needed. The mathematical reality of his choices hung in the air between them. David's emotional decision to preserve their grandmother's house had cost him approximately $55,000 over 3 years. The cash he would have received from the original sale, plus the debt he'd accumulated trying to maintain the property. $55,000? David repeated quietly. That's more than my annual salary. It's also the difference between financial independence and financial dependence, Sarah observed gently. But the important thing is that we can still fix this situation. It's more complicated now than it would have been 3 years ago, but it's not insurmountable. David was quiet for several minutes, absorbing both the scale of his financial mistakes and the possibility that they might be correctable. When he looked up again, his expression reflected a mixture of gratitude and residual shame. "Will you help me sell the house?" he asked simply. "I know I don't have any right to expect your professional services after cutting you out of my life, but I don't trust anyone else to handle this correctly." The request was both smaller and larger than Sarah had expected. Smaller because it didn't involve co-signing or financial risk on her part. Larger because it represented David's complete reversal from his previous position and his acknowledgement of her expertise in the very area where he'd once questioned her values. "I'll handle the sale," Sarah confirmed, "but I want to be clear about something. I'm doing this as your sister, not as your real estate agent. You're not my client in this transaction. You're my family. That means I'll work to get you the best possible outcome, but it also means you need to trust my judgment about strategy and timing." "I trust your judgment completely," David replied immediately. "That's what I should have said 3 years ago, instead of accusing you of being heartless." Sarah felt something settle inside her, a tension she'd carried for 3 years finally releasing. David's trust, offered without conditions or reservations, felt more valuable than his apology had. It represented genuine change rather than just regret. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Sarah said. "The timeline for your current housing situation. When did you say your landlord needs the building vacated?" "End of next month. 5 weeks from now." Sarah winced slightly at the tight timeline. Real estate sales typically take 6 to 8 weeks from listing to closing, even in favorable market conditions. We might be able to expedite the process, but it would require pricing the house aggressively and accepting the first reasonable offer we receive. "Whatever it takes," David said, without hesitation. "I'd rather sell for less money quickly than drag out the process and end up homeless while trying to maximize recovery."
The practical attitude represented another significant shift from the brother who'd been willing to go deeper into debt rather than compromise on his preservation goals. Sarah recognized the difference between desperation-driven flexibility and genuine learning, and David's response seemed to reflect the latter. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Sarah said. "The timeline for your current housing situation. When did you say your landlord needs the building vacated?" "End of next month, 5 weeks from now." Sarah winced slightly at the tight timeline. Real estate sales typically take 6 to 8 weeks from listing to closing, even in favorable market conditions. We might be able to expedite the process, but it would require pricing the house aggressively and accepting the first reasonable offer we receive. "Whatever it takes," David said, without hesitation. "I'd rather sell for less money quickly than drag out the process and end up homeless while trying to maximize recovery." The practical attitude represented another significant shift from the brother who'd been willing to go deeper into debt rather than compromise on his preservation goals. Sarah recognized the difference between desperation-driven flexibility and genuine learning, and David's response seemed to reflect the latter. "There's one more option for the housing timeline issue," Sarah said. "It's not ideal, but it would give us breathing room to handle the sale properly." David looked expectantly. "You could stay in my guest bedroom temporarily. It's a small space, basically a home office with a futon, but it would keep you from being homeless while we work through the house sale and find you appropriate permanent housing." The offer surprised Sarah as much as it clearly surprised David. She hadn't planned to extend it, but the words had emerged naturally as she considered practical solutions to his immediate crisis. "I can't ask you to do that," David protested. "You've already agreed to help with the house sale, and I've been out of your life for 3 years. Letting me stay in your home is too much to expect." "You're not asking. I'm offering."
And it's practical for both of us. You get stable housing during the transition, and I get to monitor the situation closely to ensure the sale process stays on track. David seemed to be struggling with accepting help that went beyond what he dared hope for when he'd started calling Sarah the day before. "Are you sure? I know my presence in your space would be disruptive, and you've built such a successful life without having to deal with my problems. David, you're my brother. Despite 3 years of silence, despite our arguments about the house, despite everything that's happened, you're still my brother. Helping family isn't disruptive, it's what family does." The words echoed their grandmother's practical approach to family obligation, something both of them recognized immediately. Helen Shan had never been sentimental about family relationships, but she'd been absolutely committed to family members helping each other through practical difficulties. "Okay," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for the house sale, for the temporary housing, for taking my calls yesterday when you had every right to ignore them. I don't know how I'm going to repay this kind of generosity." "You repay it by making better financial decisions going forward," Sarah replied simply, "and by rebuilding our relationship on more honest foundations than we had before." As the afternoon light faded outside Sarah's office windows, she and David worked through the practical details of their arrangement. David would move into her guest bedroom the following weekend, giving him time to pack his belongings and give notice to his current landlord. Meanwhile, Sarah would begin preparing their grandmother's house for immediate sale, including securing professional inspections and coordinating any minimal repairs needed to address the most serious code violations. The conversation that had begun with 40 desperate phone calls had evolved into something neither of them had expected: genuine reconciliation based on mutual respect and shared practical goals, rather than obligation or sentiment. David's willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and accept help with appropriate humility had created space for Sarah to respond with generosity rather than vindication. As they prepared to leave the office together, David paused at the door to Sarah's private elevator. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "When you got successful in real estate, when you made partner and started earning serious money, did you ever think about helping me financially before this crisis forced the issue?" The question deserved honest reflection rather than a quick answer. Sarah considered her own emotions over the past 3 years, the mixture of hurt and anger that had shaped her response to David's rejection of her advice. "I thought about it occasionally, especially when I'd drive past the Greenwood neighborhood and wonder how the house restoration was progressing.
But I was also angry about how our conversation had ended, and I told myself that you'd made your choice about our relationship when you declared me dead to you. I understand. David nodded. I'm glad you didn't try to help before now, actually. I don't think I would have been ready to receive it with appropriate gratitude or use it wisely. I needed to face the consequences of my choices before I could learn from them. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turns her weekend had taken. 24 hours earlier, she'd been successful but estranged from the only family she had left. Now she was preparing to share her home with the brother who'd cut her out of his life, while using her professional expertise to solve problems created by his rejection of her advice. But the strangest part was how right it felt, how naturally their conversation had evolved from desperate crisis management to genuine partnership in addressing David's situation. Perhaps this was what their grandmother had meant about death being a beginning rather than an ending. Sometimes relationships needed to die completely before they could be rebuilt on healthier foundations. "Sarah?" David said as they reached their cars. "Can I know that tomorrow is Sunday, but would you be willing to look at the house with me? I think I need to see it through your eyes, understand what you see when you evaluate it as real estate, rather than as Grandma's legacy." Sarah nodded, recognizing the importance of that transition for David's psychological acceptance of the sale. "Sunday morning works. We'll walk through it together and discuss realistic pricing strategy based on current market conditions." As she drove home through Seattle's evening traffic, Sarah found herself looking forward to tomorrow's house visit in a way that surprised her. For 3 years, their grandmother's house had been a symbol of conflict and estrangement. Tomorrow, it would become the foundation for rebuilding their relationship and securing David's financial future. The transformation wouldn't be easy or immediate, and there would undoubtedly be complications she hadn't anticipated. But for the first time since their estrangement began, Sarah felt genuinely hopeful about the possibility of having her brother back in her life. This time as an adult relationship based on mutual respect rather than childhood dynamics or family mythology. The weekend that had begun with 40 desperate phone calls was ending with the promise of genuine reconciliation and practical solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable just 24 hours earlier. Sometimes the best gifts came disguised as crises, forcing conversations that were long overdue and creating opportunities for growth that wouldn't have emerged under easier circumstances.
Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Pacific Northwest weather that seemed appropriate for confronting the past. Sarah pulled into the driveway of their grandmother's house at exactly 10 o'clock, noting immediately how much the property had deteriorated since her last visit 3 years ago. The cedar shake siding had weathered to an uneven gray, the front porch sagged noticeably on one side, and several windows had been boarded up with plywood that bore the yellow tags of city code enforcement. David was already waiting on the porch, keys in hand, and an expression that mixed determination with visible dread. He'd clearly spent considerable time preparing for this moment, mentally steeling himself to see the house through practical eyes rather than emotional filters that had guided his restoration attempts. "Thank you for coming," he said as Sarah approached the front steps, carefully testing each board before putting her full weight on it. "I think I need a professional perspective on just how bad the situation really is." Sarah nodded, pulling out her phone to document the property's current condition with photographs that would be essential for determining realistic market pricing. The exterior told a story of deferred maintenance compounded by amateur repair attempts, exactly the kind of situation that attracted investor interest while deterring conventional buyers seeking move-in ready homes. "Before we go inside," Sarah said, "I want you to understand that I'm going to evaluate this property the same way I would for any client. That means honest assessment of problems, realistic repair cost estimates, and market positioning based on actual buyer behavior rather than what we wish buyers would prioritize." "I understand," David replied, unlocking the front door with hands that trembled slightly. "I need to see this place the way buyers will see it, not the way I've been seeing it." The interior revealed the full extent of David's well-intentioned but ultimately counterproductive restoration efforts. The electrical system had indeed been updated to code, with new outlets and modern circuit breakers throughout the house, but the work had been completed without regard for aesthetic considerations, leaving exposed conduit running along baseboards and junction boxes mounted prominently on walls that hadn't been repainted after installation. The foundation repairs were similarly functional, but visually jarring.
Steel support beams now bisected what had once been an open basement area, creating an industrial appearance that eliminated any possibility of finishing the lower level as livable space. The work was structurally sound, but it had fundamentally altered the house's character and eliminated potential square footage that might have added value. The electrical and foundation work were necessary, Sarah observed, taking photographs of each room methodically, but the execution prioritized code compliance over market appeal. That's going to affect our pricing strategy and target buyer demographic. David followed her through the house silently, watching her document problems he'd either overlooked or convinced himself weren't significant. The kitchen appliances, original to the house, were now 40 years old and showed their age despite his attempts to maintain them. The bathroom fixtures were similarly dated, and water stains on the ceiling revealed ongoing plumbing issues that his repairs hadn't fully addressed. How much would it cost to make this house appealing to conventional buyers? David asked as they completed their tour of the main floor. Sarah consulted the notes she'd been making throughout their walkthrough. Assuming no major surprises during renovation, probably $60,000 to $70,000. New kitchen, updated bathroom, interior paint, flooring replacement, and exterior siding repair. That's on top of addressing the cosmetic issues created by the electrical and foundation work. And what would the house be worth after those improvements? In the current Greenwood market, probably $130,000 to $140,000, but that assumes everything goes smoothly during renovation, which is optimistic for a house this age with this repair history. David did the mathematics immediately. So even with perfect execution, we'd break even at best on the additional investment required to make this place market ready for conventional buyers. Exactly, which is why I'm recommending we target investor buyers instead of families looking for move-in ready homes. Investors understand renovation costs and timelines better than emotional buyers, and they're more likely to see the potential rather than focusing on current problems. As they moved to the second floor, the full scope of the house's challenges became even clearer. 2 of the 3 bedrooms showed signs of ongoing moisture problems, with warped flooring and discolored walls that suggested issues with the roof repairs David had completed. The 3rd bedroom, which had been their grandmother's primary living space during her final years, was in better condition but felt cramped and outdated. The moisture issues are concerning, Sarah said, photographing the damaged areas carefully. Even after roof replacement, we're seeing ongoing problems that suggest either poor installation or additional sources of water intrusion. The contractor said the roof work was guaranteed for 5 years, David replied defensively, then caught himself. But I guess guarantees don't matter if the contractor can't be found or doesn't have resources to honor them. Sarah recognized the pattern from her professional experience with clients who'd hired contractors based on low bids rather than reputation and track record. David's financial constraints had forced him to accept the cheapest options for major repairs, resulting in work that addressed immediate problems while creating new ones. We'll need professional inspections before listing, Sarah decided. Moisture problems can indicate bigger issues that aren't visible during casual walkthrough.
Better to understand the full scope of challenges before setting our asking price. They descended to the basement, where the foundation repairs dominated the space, like modern art installations that had been forcibly integrated into a traditional home. The steel beams and concrete footings were professionally installed and clearly functional, but they created an environment that felt more like a parking garage than potential living space. I spent $22,000 on this foundation work, David said, running his hand along one of the support beams. The engineer assured me it would last for decades and eliminate any structural concerns. It will, Sarah confirmed, but it also eliminated any possibility of finishing this basement as livable space, which reduces the house's potential square footage and limits buyer appeal. As they completed their assessment and prepared to leave, David stood for a moment in their grandmother's kitchen, the room where they'd spent countless hours during their teenage years. Sarah watched him process the disconnect between his emotional memories and the current reality of a house that had become more burden than blessing. I can see why you wanted to sell this place 3 years ago, he said finally. Not because you didn't care about Grandma's memory, but because you understood that preserving the building wasn't the same as preserving what made this place special. The observation reflected genuine insight rather than reluctant acceptance. David had moved beyond defending his previous choices to actually understanding the reasoning behind Sarah's original suggestion.
What made this place special was Grandma's presence and the security she provided during an impossible time in our lives, Sarah replied gently. That can't be preserved by maintaining a building, but it can be honored by making decisions she would have respected. Practical decisions based on actual circumstances rather than wishful thinking, David added, echoing Helen Chen's approach to most of life's challenges. As they completed the assessment and prepared to leave, David stood for a moment in their grandmother's kitchen, the room where they'd spent countless hours during their teenage years. Sarah watched him process the disconnect between his emotional memories and the current reality of a house that had become more burden than blessing. "When should we list it?" he asked. "I'll have the professional inspection scheduled by Wednesday. Assuming no major surprises beyond what we observed today, we can list by Friday with a pricing strategy designed to attract investor interest quickly. What kind of timeline are we looking at for the sale?" Sarah considered current market conditions and the specific buyer profile they'd be targeting. 2 to 3 weeks to generate serious interest, another 4 weeks to close. So roughly 6 weeks total, which should work with your housing timeline if we get started immediately. David nodded, visibly relieved to have concrete dates rather than uncertain waiting. "And you're still willing to let me stay in your guest room during the transition?" "It's the practical solution," Sarah confirmed. "You can move in next Saturday, and we'll plan for you to be there until we close on the house sale and you qualify for your own mortgage." The drive back to downtown Seattle gave both of them time to process the morning's revelations about the house's condition and their evolving relationship. Sarah found herself surprised by how naturally their conversation had shifted from crisis management to collaborative planning. The defensive tensions that had characterized their interactions 3 years ago had been replaced by mutual respect and shared commitment to solving problems rather than assigning blame. That evening, Sarah worked on preparing the marketing strategy for their grandmother's house, while David handled logistics for his upcoming move from his studio apartment. The professional task of positioning a challenging property for optimal sale gave her focus while processing the emotional complexity of their family reconciliation. The photographs from their morning walkthrough told the story of a property that had been loved but not professionally maintained. David's repair attempts were everywhere visible, well-intentioned efforts that had addressed immediate problems without considering long-term value or buyer perception. The house needed a buyer who could see past cosmetic issues to recognize the solid bones beneath years of amateur maintenance. Sarah drafted a marketing description that emphasized the property's investment potential while honestly acknowledging its current condition. Solid mid-century home with updated electrical and foundation systems, perfect for investors seeking value-add opportunity in desirable Greenwood location. Property sold as is, ideal for renovation or redevelopment. The language was carefully chosen to attract exactly the buyer demographic most likely to appreciate the house's potential, while deterring families who might waste everyone's time with unrealistic expectations about move-in readiness. Professional investors understood that properties requiring work often offered the best returns, assuming the purchase price reflected actual rather than aspirational value. Monday morning brought the professional inspections Sarah had arranged, conducted by contractors she'd worked with on numerous investment properties. Their reports confirmed her initial assessment while revealing 2 additional concerns that would affect pricing strategy: outdated HVAC systems that would need replacement within the next few years, and soil drainage issues that explain the ongoing moisture problems despite roof repairs. The inspection findings required adjusting their marketing approach to reflect additional deferred maintenance beyond what was immediately visible. Sarah recalculated fair market value based on the comprehensive repair estimates, settling on an asking price of $87,000 that would attract investor interest while still providing David with enough proceeds to meaningfully improve his debt situation. $87,000 seems low, David said, when Sarah called to discuss the pricing recommendation. "I was hoping we might get closer to 95 based on recent sales in the neighborhood."
Properties that needed work but didn't have ongoing moisture issues or major systems approaching end-of-life replacement. Our pricing needs to reflect actual condition, not neighborhood averages. David was quiet for a moment, absorbing the mathematics of his situation. So my half would be approximately $43,000, which leaves me owing about $17,000 on the existing loans. Correct. But that $17,000 would become unsecured debt that we could restructure as a manageable personal loan, dramatically improving your debt-to-income ratio for mortgage qualification purposes. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes as Sarah explained the broader strategy behind aggressive pricing, generating multiple offers quickly rather than waiting for an ideal buyer who might never materialize. David's questions demonstrated genuine effort to understand real estate dynamics, rather than simply accepting her recommendations based on family trust. "I'm comfortable with the $87,000 price," David concluded. "Getting this resolved quickly is worth more to me than trying to maximize every possible dollar." Sarah felt genuine pride in her brother's newfound ability to prioritize practical outcomes over emotional attachment to theoretical value. The David who'd accumulated $60,000 in debt trying to preserve their grandmother's house was learning to make decisions based on actual circumstances rather than wishful projections. The house listing went live Friday morning, accompanied by professional photographs that presented the property honestly while emphasizing its potential for buyers with renovation experience. Sarah's marketing emphasized location, lot size, and structural improvements, while clearly indicating that cosmetic updates would be required. Investor interest materialized immediately. By Friday afternoon, 3 different contractors had requested showing appointments for the weekend. The swift response validated Sarah's pricing strategy, while confirming that Seattle's investment market remained robust for properties positioned correctly. Saturday brought David's move into Sarah's guest bedroom, an awkward but necessary transition that both siblings approached with careful consideration for boundaries and mutual respect. David arrived with 2 suitcases and a box of teaching materials, his possessions reduced to what was essential for the temporary arrangement. "I know this isn't ideal for either of us," he said, as Sarah showed him the compact space that would be his home for the next several weeks. "I promise to be the least disruptive houseguest possible." The guest bedroom was indeed small, barely large enough for a futon, desk, and dresser, but it offered privacy and dignity that staying with friends or in extended-stay motels couldn't match. More importantly, it provided David with stable housing while they navigated the complexities of the house sale and his mortgage qualification process. "We're both adults," Sarah replied simply. "We can make this arrangement work as long as we communicate clearly about expectations and respect each other's space." The first few days of their cohabitation required adjustment for both of them. Sarah was accustomed to living alone, controlling her environment completely, and maintaining routines optimized for her schedule and preferences. David's presence, however unobtrusive he tried to be, represented a significant change in her domestic tranquility. But the arrangement also provided unexpected benefits. David proved to be an excellent houseguest, contributing to grocery costs, handling household tasks without being asked, and respecting Sarah's need for quiet workspace when she brought client materials home. More significantly, their daily interactions allowed their relationship to develop naturally, beyond the crisis management that had prompted their reunion. Evening conversations over simple dinners revealed how much both of their perspectives had evolved during their 3-year estrangement. David shared insights about his teaching career, his students, and his growing interest in financial literacy education, inspired by his own recent experiences with poor money management. Sarah found herself describing her real estate work in ways that emphasized its social impact rather than just professional achievement, helping families build wealth through property ownership and revitalizing neighborhoods through strategic development. "I've been thinking about something you said during our first conversation," David mentioned one evening as they cleaned up after dinner, "about how your success helps families build wealth rather than just generating commissions for yourself." "What about it?" Sarah asked, loading dishes into the dishwasher with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to maintaining order. "It made me realize that my teaching could have broader impact too, beyond just helping individual students learn history. I've been researching financial literacy curriculum development, thinking about ways to integrate practical money management into social studies education." The initiative reflected David's growing understanding that expertise could serve purposes beyond personal advancement, something Sarah recognized from her own career evolution.
Her most satisfying professional relationships involved clients whose success created positive community impact rather than just individual wealth accumulation. There's definitely need for that kind of curriculum integration, Sarah confirmed. Most students graduate without basic understanding of credit, mortgages, investment principles, or budgeting strategies. Exactly. And most of them are going to face financial decisions much more complex than anything I was prepared for at their age. If I'd understood debt-to-income ratios and renovation cost analysis 3 years ago, I might have made completely different choices about grandmother's house. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing with a call from her listing agent, reporting that the house had received its first formal offer after 3 days on the market. The offer was for $85,000, slightly below asking price, but from a cash buyer who could close within 3 weeks. It's a solid offer from a credible buyer, Sarah explained to David after ending the call.
$2,000 below asking price, but the quick cash closing timeline is worth that difference given your housing situation. David considered the numbers without the emotional attachment that might have complicated his decision-making in the past. My half would be $42,500, leaving me with debt of approximately $17,500. That's manageable as personal loan debt, and the quick closing gives us plenty of time to secure mortgage financing for my own place. Do you want to accept this offer or wait to see if additional offers come in over the weekend? Sarah asked, giving him full decision-making authority despite her professional recommendation. Let's accept it, David decided without hesitation. I'd rather have certainty and move forward than gamble on potentially better terms that might not materialize. Sarah felt proud of David's mature approach to the decision, prioritizing practical outcomes over theoretical optimization. The brother who'd once been willing to accumulate unlimited debt rather than compromise on his preservation goals was now making choices based on realistic assessment of risks and benefits. The offer acceptance process moved smoothly, with professional inspections scheduled for the following week and closing planned for 3 weeks from Saturday. David's transformation from desperate crisis management to collaborative problem-solving had created momentum that was carrying both of them toward resolution of issues that had seemed insurmountable just 2 weeks earlier. During the inspection period, Sarah began working with David to pre-qualify him for mortgage financing based on his improved debt profile after the house sale. The process required gathering documentation of his employment history, updating credit reports, and calculating realistic budgets for different housing options within his price range. Your credit score has actually improved slightly over the past year, the mortgage broker noted during their consultation meeting. Consistent payments on your existing debt obligations demonstrate reliability, even though the debt load itself has been problematic for qualification purposes. The improved credit score reflected David's fundamental integrity regarding financial obligations, something that would work in his favor once his debt-to-income ratio returned to acceptable levels. Sarah felt optimistic about his prospects for securing favorable mortgage terms once the house sale eliminated his major debt burden. "What kind of price range should I be considering?" David asked as they reviewed various loan programs and qualification criteria. "Based on your teaching salary and assuming $17,000 in remaining personal debt, you should qualify for mortgages up to about $160,000, the broker calculated. That opens up options in the condo market as well as some single-family homes in neighborhoods further from downtown." The price range represented a significant improvement over David's current situation, while remaining realistic given his income level. Sarah began researching properties within his price range that would provide good value while supporting his long-term financial stability, rather than stretching his resources to their maximum limits. "I'd recommend staying well below your maximum qualification level," Sarah advised during their drive home from the mortgage consultation. "Buying something for $130,000 to $140,000 leaves you with comfortable monthly payments and room in your budget for savings and unexpected expenses." David nodded agreement, demonstrating his newfound appreciation for conservative financial planning. "After what I've been through with the house, I never want to be financially overextended again. I'd rather have a smaller place that I can afford comfortably than stretch for something that might become a burden."
The following week brought successful completion of the buyer's inspections on their grandmother's house, with no major surprises beyond the issues already documented in their marketing materials. The cash sale proceeded toward closing without complications, providing David with increasing confidence about his timeline for securing permanent housing. Sarah had identified several properties within David's preferred price range, including a well-maintained townhouse in Mount Lake Terrace and an updated condo in Linwood that offered excellent value for first-time buyers. Both options provided significantly more space than his current studio apartment, while keeping monthly housing costs at manageable levels. "I like the townhouse better," David said after visiting both properties with Sarah serving as his buyer's agent. "The extra bedroom could serve as a home office, and having a small yard appeals to me more than condo living." "The townhouse is also a better long-term investment," Sarah confirmed. "Single-family detached properties typically appreciate faster than condos, and you'd be building equity in land as well as structure." The offer process for David's townhouse proceeded smoothly, with the seller accepting his bid of $138,000 after minimal negotiation. David's pre-qualification letter and demonstrated employment stability made him an attractive buyer despite the modest offer amount. As closing day approached for the sale of their grandmother's house and David's purchase of his townhouse, Sarah reflected on the dramatic transformation their relationship had undergone in less than a month. The crisis that had prompted 40 desperate phone calls had evolved into genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared practical goals. "I keep thinking about something Grandma used to say," David mentioned one evening as they prepared dinner together in Sarah's kitchen, "about how the best gifts sometimes come disguised as problems that force you to grow." Sarah remembered their grandmother's practical wisdom about finding opportunity within adversity, something Helen Chen had demonstrated repeatedly during their childhood years following their parents' death. She always said that avoiding problems made them bigger, but facing them directly usually revealed solutions you couldn't see initially. "Getting my mortgage denied was the problem that forced me to confront everything I had been avoiding about my financial decisions. If the lending had gone through, I probably would have continued making the same mistakes indefinitely." The insight demonstrated David's continued growth in understanding the difference between symptoms and underlying causes. His mortgage denial had merely been the visible consequence of years of emotional decision-making about money, but addressing the fundamental patterns had created sustainable improvement rather than temporary fixes. Closing day arrived with the crisp efficiency that characterized well-managed real estate transactions.
Sarah accompanied David to both closings, first selling their grandmother's house and then purchasing his townhouse, completing the financial transformation they'd planned together. The final numbers exceeded their projections slightly, with David netting $43,000 from his half of the house sale and qualifying for a mortgage with better terms than the broker had initially estimated. After paying down his existing debt and covering closing costs for his new home, he had nearly $8,000 remaining as an emergency fund. $8,000 in savings, David said, as they celebrated with dinner at a restaurant near his new townhouse. 6 months ago, I had negative net worth and was accumulating more debt every month. The turnaround feels almost impossible. Sarah raised her glass of wine in toast to David's remarkable financial recovery. "It happened because you were willing to face reality and make difficult decisions based on actual circumstances rather than emotional attachment. That's not an easy skill to develop." "I had an excellent teacher," David replied, acknowledging Sarah's role in his transformation while also recognizing his own commitment to changing patterns that had proven destructive. The weekend of David's move into his townhouse marked the official end of their temporary living arrangement, but both siblings recognized that their relationship had been permanently altered by the experience. The crisis-driven reunion had evolved into genuine adult connection, based on mutual respect rather than childhood dynamics or family obligation. "You know," David said as they finished moving his belongings into his new home, "I'm grateful for everything that happened, even the financial mess that created this crisis. If I hadn't been desperate enough to call you, I might never have learned how much I was limiting both of us with my stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality."
Sarah felt similar gratitude for the unexpected opportunity to rebuild their relationship on healthier foundations. The 3 years of silence were painful, but they might have been necessary. We both needed time to develop as individuals before we could relate to each other as adults rather than the siblings we used to be. As autumn progressed into winter, Sarah and David maintained regular contact that reflected their evolved relationship. David's teaching schedule and Sarah's real estate demands prevented frequent social interaction, but they established weekly dinners that provided consistent opportunity for meaningful conversation about their respective professional developments and personal growth. David's interest in financial literacy curriculum had evolved into concrete action, with him developing lesson plans that integrated practical money management concepts into his history classes. His students were learning about economic decision-making through historical case studies, while also gaining exposure to budgeting, credit, and investment principles that would serve them beyond high school. I'm using our situation with Grandma's house as one of my case studies. Obviously, I don't share personal details, but I present the basic scenario: inherited property, emotional attachment versus financial reality, long-term consequences of different decision approaches. What conclusions are your students reaching? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about teenage perspectives on their family dilemma. Most of them initially favor the emotional approach, preserving the house regardless of cost, but when we work through the actual numbers and timeline, they start understanding how good intentions can lead to bad outcomes without proper financial planning. Sarah felt impressed by David's ability to transform his personal mistakes into educational value for his students. The curriculum development reflected his continued growth in separating emotional reactions from analytical thinking, skills that had broader application than just real estate decisions. Meanwhile, Sarah's professional success had continued accelerating, with her role at Morrison & Associates expanding to include mentorship of junior agents and strategic planning for the firm's residential division. Her track record of identifying emerging neighborhoods before they became profitable had established her reputation throughout Seattle's real estate community. "I've been thinking about something," Sarah mentioned during one of their winter dinners, "about starting an investment fund focused on acquiring and renovating properties in transitional neighborhoods, specifically targeting first-time buyers and young families." David looked up from his meal with interest. "That sounds like it would combine your market analysis skills with genuine community impact." Exactly. Instead of just helping wealthy clients build wealth through real estate, I could help working families access homeownership while revitalizing neighborhoods that have been overlooked by traditional development. The initiative reflected Sarah's evolving understanding of her professional purpose, moving beyond personal success toward creating systematic positive impact through her expertise. David's influence had contributed to this perspective. His dedication to education inspired Sarah to consider how her skills could serve broader social benefits. "Would Morrison & Associates support that kind of fund development?" David asked. "They're interested in any initiative that generates returns while building the firm's reputation for innovation. But I'd probably need to start small, maybe with private investors who share the social impact goals rather than just seeking maximum returns." Their conversation continued for hours, exploring the practical and philosophical aspects of Sarah's emerging business concept. David's questions demonstrated his growing sophistication about real estate investment principles, while also reflecting his educator's instinct for identifying how complex ideas could be made accessible to broader audiences. "You could potentially tie this into curriculum development, too," David suggested. "Real-world case studies of neighborhood revitalization, economic development through strategic property investment, the role of homeownership in building generational wealth." Sarah felt energized by the possibility of collaboration that would leverage both their expertise in service of shared goals. The investment fund concept became more compelling as she considered its educational potential alongside its financial and community development objectives. Spring brought concrete progress on both siblings' professional initiatives.
David's financial literacy curriculum had attracted attention from the school district's administration, with discussions underway about expanding the program to other high schools throughout Seattle. Sarah had secured preliminary funding commitments for her neighborhood revitalization investment fund, with plans to launch pilot projects in 2 transitional areas she'd been monitoring for over a year. "I have news," Sarah announced during one of their Wednesday evening dinners.
Morrison and Associates approved my proposal for the Neighborhood Investment Fund. We're starting with $2 million in capital and targeting our first acquisitions this summer. David's face lit up with genuine excitement for Sarah's professional expansion. That's incredible! You're going to be helping families build wealth while improving entire neighborhoods. The pilot program will focus on properties similar to Grandma's house, Sarah explained. Solid bones, but deferred maintenance. Perfect for renovation and sale to first-time buyers at prices they can actually afford. The irony of using their grandmother's house as a template for community development wasn't lost on either of them. David's mistakes with the property had provided valuable lessons about renovation costs, market dynamics, and buyer psychology that would inform Sarah's professional strategies for years to come. I want to document this process carefully, David said thoughtfully, both for my curriculum development and for helping other families avoid the mistakes I made with inherited properties. Sarah nodded agreement, recognizing the educational value of their experience beyond its personal significance. We could potentially collaborate on that documentation. Your teaching skills would be valuable for making complex real estate concepts accessible to general audiences. The conversation marked another evolution in their relationship, from family reconciliation to professional partnership based on complementary expertise and shared values. Their individual growth had created opportunity for collaboration that neither could have achieved alone. As summer arrived, both siblings were implementing the initiatives they'd developed through their year of rebuilding their relationship. David's financial literacy curriculum had been adopted by 4 additional high schools, with plans for district-wide implementation the following year. Sarah's investment fund had completed its first 2 property acquisitions, both houses remarkably similar to their grandmothers in age, condition, and potential for value-added renovation. The first house is under contract to a young teacher, Sarah reported during one of their weekly dinners. She's getting a completely renovated home for less than she would pay for a condo, and she'll be building equity instead of paying rent. David's face lit up with genuine excitement for Sarah's professional expansion. That's incredible! You're going to be helping families build wealth while improving entire neighborhoods. The pilot program will focus on properties similar to Grandma's house, Sarah explained. Solid bones, but deferred maintenance. Perfect for renovation and sale to first-time buyers at prices they can actually afford. The irony of using their grandmother's house as a template for community development wasn't lost on either of them. David's mistakes with the property had provided valuable lessons about renovation costs, market dynamics, and buyer psychology that would inform Sarah's professional strategies for years to come. I want to document this process carefully, David said thoughtfully, both for my curriculum development and for helping other families avoid the mistakes I made with inherited properties. Sarah nodded agreement, recognizing the educational value of their experience beyond its personal significance. We could potentially collaborate on that documentation. Your teaching skills would be valuable for making complex real estate concepts accessible to general audiences. The conversation marked another evolution in their relationship, from family reconciliation to professional partnership based on complementary expertise and shared values. Their individual growth had created opportunity for collaboration that neither could have achieved alone. As summer arrived, both siblings were implementing the initiatives they'd developed through their year of rebuilding their relationship. David's financial literacy curriculum had been adopted by 4 additional high schools, with plans for district-wide implementation the following year. Sarah's investment fund had completed its first 2 property acquisitions, both houses remarkably similar to their grandmothers in age, condition, and potential for value-added renovation. The first house is under contract to a young teacher, Sarah reported during one of their weekly dinners. She's getting a completely renovated home for less than she would pay for a condo, and she'll be building equity instead of paying rent. David smiled at the symmetry of a teacher benefiting from Sarah's initiative. That's exactly the kind of outcome Grandma would have wanted to see from her house situation, even though we took a more complicated path to get there. Their grandmother's house had indeed served its ultimate purpose, not as a preserved museum of family memory, but as the catalyst for growth that enabled both siblings to contribute more meaningfully to their community. The crisis that had forced their reunion had revealed strengths and possibilities neither had recognized when they were focused on defending their original positions. "I've been thinking about timing," Sarah said as they walked through David's neighborhood after dinner.
how the crisis with your mortgage denial happened at exactly the right moment for both of us to be ready for genuine reconciliation. If you'd tried to help me financially 2 years ago, I probably would have accepted the assistance without learning from my mistakes, David agreed. And if I'd reached out before I was desperate enough to admit I was wrong, we might not have had the honest conversations that actually rebuilt our relationship. The observation reflected their shared understanding that some growth requires crisis as catalyst, that comfortable circumstances rarely provide sufficient motivation for examining fundamental assumptions or changing established patterns. As they prepared for another academic year and another cycle of real estate market fluctuations, both siblings felt confident about their individual trajectories while also appreciating the support system their reconciliation had created. David's townhouse had become the venue for monthly dinner parties that mixed Sarah's real estate colleagues with David's education friends, creating connections that enriched both their professional networks. "I have something for you," David said during one of these gatherings, presenting Sarah with a small wrapped package. "It's not much, but I wanted to mark the anniversary of when everything started changing." Sarah opened the gift to find a vintage photograph of their grandmother's house, taken during their childhood when the property was well-maintained and filled with the warmth of Helen Chen's presence. But the frame bore a small plaque that read, "In memory of dreams that had to die so better ones could grow." The inscription captured perfectly the philosophical journey both siblings had completed over the past year. Their grandmother's house had needed to become a financial disaster in David's hands before it could fulfill its true purpose as the foundation for their adult relationship and professional growth. "It's perfect," Sarah said, genuinely moved by David's thoughtfulness. "I'll keep it in my office as a reminder that the best solutions often require letting go of what we thought we wanted." As autumn returned and their weekly dinners marked a full year since David's 40 desperate phone calls had shattered 3 years of silence, both siblings could measure their growth in concrete terms. David's net worth had shifted from deeply negative to modestly positive, while his professional reputation had expanded beyond classroom teaching to curriculum development and district-level educational strategy. Sarah's success had evolved from personal achievement to systemic impact, with her investment fund helping dozens of families access homeownership and revitalize neighborhoods throughout Seattle. More importantly, her relationship with David had provided the personal foundation that made professional risk-taking feel possible rather than reckless. "Next month marks exactly 1 year since I started calling you. 40 missed calls because I was too proud to leave a voicemail explaining that I needed help." Sarah laughed at the memory of watching her phone light up repeatedly with calls from a number she'd almost forgotten.
I wasn't ready to answer until call number 38. Sometimes timing requires that kind of persistence. Or that kind of desperation, David added, with self-deprecating humor that had replaced the defensive pride characterizing his personality a year earlier. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing with a call from a potential client, a divorced father seeking help with strategic property acquisition for long-term financial security. The inquiry represented exactly the kind of complex family situation that Sarah's expertise could address while creating meaningful, positive impact. "Take the call," David encouraged. "I'll order dessert and wait." As Sarah stepped outside to speak privately with the potential client, David reflected on how completely their relationship had transformed over the past year. The sister he'd declared dead to him had become his closest confidant and most trusted advisor, while also serving as inspiration for his own professional evolution. When Sarah returned 20 minutes later, her expression reflected the satisfaction that came from matching her expertise with someone's genuine need for guidance. "Another family situation requiring both financial and emotional navigation," she reported. "Property division from divorce, children's college funding, long-term security planning, exactly the kind of comprehensive approach I've learned to appreciate through our experience." David nodded understanding, recognizing how their personal crisis had enhanced Sarah's ability to serve clients facing similar challenges. Professional expertise became more valuable when tempered by personal experience with the emotional complexity underlying financial decisions. "We should write about this," David suggested, as they shared dessert. "Not our personal story specifically, but the broader lessons about family, money, and the difference between preserving the past and building the future."
Sarah considered the proposal, intrigued by the possibility of collaborative writing that could serve educational purposes while processing their own experience more completely. A book about family financial decision-making, case studies of common situations where emotion and analysis conflict? Exactly. Real estate, inheritance, business succession, elder care planning, all the situations where families have to balance sentiment with practical considerations. The conversation continued late into the evening as they outlined potential approaches to documenting insights that had emerged from their journey together. Both recognized that their experience, while personally specific, reflected patterns that affected thousands of families navigating similar challenges between emotional attachment and financial reality. As they parted ways that evening, Sarah felt grateful not just for their reconciliation, but for the growth that had made their relationship stronger than it had ever been during their childhood. The crisis that had begun with 40 desperate phone calls had created opportunity for building something entirely new, rather than simply restoring what had existed before. David's townhouse, purchased with proceeds from selling their grandmother's house, had become a symbol of practical wisdom applied to emotional situations. The weekly dinners they shared had evolved into collaborative planning sessions for initiatives that served purposes beyond their individual advancement. Most importantly, their relationship had demonstrated that sometimes the best way to honor memory is to let go of preservation attempts that prevent growth. Their grandmother's house had served its ultimate purpose not by being maintained as a shrine, but by forcing conversations that revealed how much both siblings had learned about turning crisis into opportunity. The year that had begun with David declaring financial emergency had ended with both siblings positioned for continued growth based on lessons learned through necessity rather than choice. Their story had become proof that family bonds could survive complete breakdown and emerge stronger through honest acknowledgement of mistakes, followed by commitment to different patterns moving forward. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.